Grand Studio was thick with tension as political analysts engaged in an intense debate about Donald Trump. Sharp criticisms flew like daggers, aimed squarely at the former president. "What has Donald Trump done for this country besides sow division?" one analyst declared, their voice sharp and piercing. "Look at the Capitol attack on January 6th. That's the legacy he left behind. A nation torn apart by hatred and violence." Another quickly chimed in, equally heated. "And let's not forget the financial investigations hanging over his head like a storm cloud. Does anyone seriously believe he won't face justice? This isn't just about politics anymore. It's about morality." The cameras panned across the studio, capturing angry glares and animated gestures from the panelists. The host tried to maintain composure, but the debate had spiraled out of control. Even the audience watching at home could feel the oppressive weight of the argument. Suddenly, a firm voice cut through the chaos, commanding attention. "I need to say something." The entire room froze, heads turning toward the source of the voice. Standing in the doorway was Barron Trump, tall, poised, and calm, under the bright studio lights. His eyes shone with a rare determination. The host, visibly taken aback, hesitated before speaking. "Barron, you have something to say?" Barron stepped forward, his movements slow but deliberate. The room fell silent, every eye fixed on him. The youngest son of Donald Trump, rarely seen or heard in public, now stood at the center of a political storm. Barron stood tall, his broad shoulders steady under the glare of the studio lights. The cameras zoomed in on him, capturing the quiet intensity in his gaze, a gaze that never wavered, even as dozens of scrutinizing eyes bore into him. His hands hung calmly at his sides, his presence alone commanding attention. When he finally spoke, his voice rang out, deep and clear, slicing through the tension like a knife. "I cannot remain silent while my father is being unfairly judged." The weight of his words hung in the air, freezing the room in a stunned silence. The stillness was so profound that it felt as though everyone had collectively stopped breathing, caught off guard by the strength and conviction in the voice of someone so young. The sound of his voice seemed to echo, bouncing off the walls, as though daring anyone to challenge him. But the silence didn't last long. A sharp voice broke through the quiet, shattering the fragile stillness like glass. One of the political analysts leaned forward in their chair, their tone cutting and challenging. "Barron, you may be his son, but you cannot deny that your father has caused deep divisions in this country. You're just a teenager. Do you truly understand the consequences of his actions? Do you even understand what you're defending?" The question hung in the air like a taunt, but Barron didn't flinch. Instead, he turned his head slowly, meeting the analyst's gaze directly. There was no anger in his expression, no hint of defensiveness, just calm, unshakable determination. His steady gaze carried a weight that seemed to still the analyst's confidence. And when he responded, it was with the measured tone of someone who had thought long and hard about what he was going to say. "Yes, I am a teenager," he began, his voice steady and deliberate, as if he were choosing each word with great care. "But that doesn't mean I don't understand the truth. My father is not perfect. He has never claimed to be. But what I know for certain is that he has fought for what he believes is right. He has defended freedom, protected family values, and stood up for Christian faith, values that many of us have forgotten or taken for granted." He paused, letting his words settle in the air, giving everyone in the room a chance to absorb what he was saying. The cameras zoomed closer, capturing every subtle nuance of his expression. Barron's eyes scanned the room, taking in the mix of curiosity, skepticism, and unease that flickered across the faces of the analysts, the host, and the audience members seated in the shadows. "But let's address the real issue," he continued, his voice growing firmer, more resolute. You say my father is the cause of division in this country. Let's face reality. This country was divided long before he became president. He didn't create that division. He dared to confront it. He dared to stand up when others chose to stay silent. His voice, though still calm, carried a quiet power that filled the room. Every word landed with the weight of conviction, making it impossible for anyone to dismiss him outright. And let me be clear, Barron added, his tone sharpening slightly, as though he wanted to leave no room for misinterpretation. I'm not saying that every decision my father has made is perfect or beyond reproach. I'm not here to excuse every controversy or action, but I will not sit back while the truth is twisted by unfair criticism. My father deserves to be seen as more than the caricature people have made him out to be. There was no hint of hesitation in his voice. Barron's words were unyielding, like a wall that no amount of opposition could break. The room was silent again, but this time, it wasn't the stunned silence of shock. It was a heavier stillness, the kind that comes when people are forced to confront uncomfortable truths. The analyst who had challenged him leaned back slightly in their chair, their expression shifting from sharpness to something softer, perhaps reflection, perhaps unease. Others exchanged glances, some fidgeting uncomfortably as Barron's words echoed in their minds. The silence wasn't just in the room. In that moment, even the viewers at home, glued to their screens, felt the gravity of what was unfolding. The studio lights, the cameras, the walls, they all seemed to fade into the background as Barron stood alone in the spotlight, his voice and presence commanding the moment. He paused again, his gaze sweeping the room one final time, as though silently inviting anyone else to challenge him. But no one spoke. No one dared. As Barron finished his previous statement, the tension in the room reached a boiling point. Every eye in the studio was on him, yet the weight of the scrutiny seemed to bounce off him like raindrops on steel. Suddenly, an analyst, who had been sitting with an air of smug superiority, leaned forward. They couldn't hold back a smirk as they addressed him, their voice dripping with sarcasm and condescension. You're standing here, talking about your father as if he's some kind of saint. But let's look at the facts. Barron, what has he done besides anger millions of people? The Capitol riot, what was that if not the direct result of his words and actions? And you dare to call that freedom? The words hung in the air, charged with challenge and provocation. A murmur rippled through the audience, a mixture of agreement, unease, and curiosity. The cameras captured every reaction, raised eyebrows, heads nodding in agreement, and others leaning forward, eager to see how Barron would respond. But Barron didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his posture unyielding, his expression calm yet resolute. His gaze locked onto the analyst, unwavering, his eyes filled with a mix of control and intensity, with just a flicker of restrained indignation. The silence that followed was deafening, as if the entire room was holding its breath. When Barron finally spoke, his voice was measured, steady, but with an undertone of passion that made every word land with precision. "No," he said firmly, letting the single word cut through the tension before continuing. "I'm not saying what happened that day was right. I'm not justifying any act of violence. But what is truly wrong is blaming all of it on one person. My father did not incite violence. He called for peace. He asked people to go home. But you ignore that. You only focus on what fits the story you want to tell." His words seemed to echo in the room, and the audience collectively leaned in, drawn by the conviction in his tone. His voice grew stronger as he continued, each word slicing through the charged atmosphere like a blade. "My father has been turned into a symbol of hate, but you don't see the real man behind that symbol. You don't see the sacrifices he's made, the battles he's fought, not for himself, but because he believes in a stronger America, an America that isn't suffocated by fear, division, and judgment. The analyst who had spoken earlier looked like they wanted to interject, but Barron didn't give them a chance. He pressed on, his voice ringing with clarity and determination. And let me make something clear. I'm not standing here to defend every action my father has ever taken. I know he's not perfect, but perfection isn't the standard we should use to measure someone's worth. I'm here to say that he doesn't deserve to be buried under false and one-sided accusations. He's not the caricature you've made him out to be. He's a person, a father, a husband, and someone who believes in this country's potential. The room, once buzzing with energy and tension, now fell into a heavy silence. Barron's words lingered in the air, compelling even the most outspoken critics to pause and reflect. One of the analysts, who had been among the loudest and most vocal critics, leaned back in their chair. Their confident demeanor had softened, their expression shifting to one of contemplation. Finally, they leaned forward slightly, breaking the silence with a voice that lacked its earlier sharpness. "Barron," they began, their tone subdued. "I don't agree with everything you've said, but you're right about one thing. We often see things only through the lens of criticism. We get so caught up in the debates and the headlines that we forget. Behind all of this is a person. Maybe we've been too harsh." The admission, though quiet, sent ripples through the room. Some analysts glanced at one another, as if reconsidering their own views. The audience, too, seemed to feel the shift, the tension giving way to something more introspective. Then, from the crowd, a single clap broke the silence. It was followed by another, and then another, until the applause grew into a wave that filled the studio. This time, no one tried to stop it. The cameras panned across the room, capturing the mix of faces, some thoughtful, some emotional, some still skeptical but undeniably moved. The applause blended with the lingering silence, creating a moment that transcended the usual noise of political debate. Barron stood in the middle of it all, his expression composed, his posture steady. He didn't smile or show any sign of triumph. He simply let the moment wash over him, knowing that he had spoken his truth. And for the first time that evening, it felt like the room had truly heard him. The tension in the studio was almost suffocating. The air felt heavy with unspoken thoughts, and every breath seemed to carry the weight of anticipation. All eyes were locked on Barron, who had just delivered a powerful defense of his father with sincerity and strength that belied his age. His words had shifted the atmosphere, turning a heated debate into something far more introspective. For a long moment, no one spoke. The studio lights flickered slightly, casting a faint glow over the panel of analysts, most of whom were now sitting in uncharacteristic silence. Then, slowly, one of them rose to their feet. This was someone known for their sharp, often unforgiving critiques of Donald Trump, someone who had made a career out of dissecting his actions with ruthless precision. But as they stood, there was something different in their demeanor. The usual confidence, even arrogance, was replaced by a hint of hesitation. Their expression was thoughtful, almost uncomfortable, as though they were wrestling with an internal conflict. Clearing their throats softly, they began to speak, their tone far less combative than it had been earlier. "Barron, I have to admit, I've spent years criticizing your father. I've condemned him for actions and words that I believed were harmful to this country. I've spoken harshly, sometimes too harshly, if I'm honest. But hearing you speak today, it's made me realize something I've overlooked all this time." They paused, their words hanging in the air, and glanced down for a moment, as if searching for the right way to continue. When they looked back up, their gaze had softened, and their voice was quieter now, more reflective. We often forget that behind every public figure is a family, real people, not just symbols in the endless political debates we engage in. Your father isn't just a name in the headlines or a talking point in arguments. He's a person, a husband, a father. And perhaps I've been too harsh, not only on him, but in the way I've approached all of this. The admission landed like a pebble dropped into a still pond, sending ripples through the room. The other analysts exchanged glances, some visibly surprised by the rare moment of vulnerability from one of their own. The audience, too, seemed to sense the gravity of what had just been said. The camera captured the faint flicker of emotion on the speaker's face, an unguarded moment of self-awareness. Barron turned to face the analyst directly, his posture steady and composed. His gaze was unflinching but held no hostility, only a quiet maturity that seemed to fill the room. When he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, and free of triumph. "Thank you for understanding. I'm not asking anyone to agree with my father, and I know not everyone will change how they see him. That's not what this is about. I only hope that people can see him for what he is, a person, a father, a husband, and a patriot. The things he's done may be controversial, but that doesn't change the fact that he has always believed in what's best for this country." Barron's words were like a gentle wave, washing over the room and leaving a profound stillness in their wake. His tone carried no bitterness, no self-righteousness, only an earnest desire to convey his truth. It was impossible not to feel the weight of his sincerity, and for a moment, it seemed as though everyone in the studio was united in quiet contemplation. The analyst who had spoken earlier nodded slowly, their expression thoughtful, as if they were reevaluating not just their stance on Donald Trump, but their approach to public discourse as a whole. Other analysts shifted in their seats, some leaning forward as if to speak, only to hold back. The silence was thick but not uncomfortable. It was a silence filled with reflection. Then, from somewhere in the audience, a single clap broke the quiet. It was tentative at first, but it carried a resolute energy that seemed to cut through the tension. Another clap followed, then another, until the sound swelled into a wave of applause that filled the studio. The analysts at the table joined in hesitantly at first, but soon they, too, were clapping, some with genuine admiration, others with grudging respect. The cameras zoomed in on Barron, capturing the composed look on his face. He didn't smile or acknowledge the applause with a triumphant gesture. Instead, he stood quietly, his expression calm and steady, as if he were content to let the moment speak for itself. And in that moment, something profound had shifted. Barron hadn't just changed the mind of one analyst. He had compelled the entire room to reconsider the way they judged not only his father, but the people behind every headline and soundbite. For once, the studio wasn't a place of division, but of introspection, where the line between criticism and compassion had blurred, if only for a moment. In his private office at Mar-a-Lago, Donald Trump sat before a large screen, the flickering images casting shadows on his contemplative face. His hands, often raised to emphasize points during speeches, were now folded across his chest. Full of thought, he watched every word Barron spoke, every gesture his youngest son made, his eyes never leaving the screen for even a second. When Barron finished his final words, the room seemed quieter than ever. Trump leaned back in his chair slowly, his gaze filled with an emotion rarely seen, an expression of quiet pride and deep reflection softening his usually resolute and steadfast demeanor. "That boy," he murmured, his voice no longer sharp but warm and subdued. A glimmer of both pride and surprise flickered in his eyes. "He didn't just defend me. He understands the truth better than so many adults who claim to know everything. And he said what most wouldn't dare to say." Rising from his chair, Trump walked out onto the balcony, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the vibrant hues of the setting sun painted the ocean in shades of gold and crimson. A strange yet familiar feeling stirred in his chest, a mixture of pride and awe, not just for his son, but for how Barron had exceeded every expectation. Trump gave a small nod, as though affirming something to himself. He's not a child anymore. Barron has grown up, and he's shown the world that the love of family is stronger than any criticism. In that moment, Trump was no longer just a former president or a political figure surrounded by controversy. He was a father, and Barron had reminded him that, despite all the storms, family remained the foundation that kept him grounded. Barron stood motionless for a moment, his figure tall and steady beneath the piercing studio lights. His gaze swept across the room, passing over the faces of analysts and audience members, and then lingered on the cameras trained on him. Each lens captured the intensity of his expression, the determination in his eyes, the subtle furrow in his brow, and the calm authority he exuded. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured and deep, carrying the weight of emotion and conviction that belied his age. "My father doesn't need me to stand up here and defend him," Barron began, his words ringing clearly in the silent studio. "He has faced the harshest attacks, endured relentless accusations, and yet, through it all, he's still standing." The room remained utterly still, the air heavy with anticipation. Even the analysts, who moments before had been vocal in their critiques, now seemed frozen, their pens hovering over notepads, their gazes locked on the young man commanding the room. Barron paused, his chest rising and falling as he drew a deep, steadying breath. When he continued, his voice was resolute, every word deliberate. "But I need to speak," he said, his tone firm, "because I can't let people continue to view him through the lens of what they choose to believe. My father is not a perfect symbol, and he has never claimed to be, but he is a fighter." The word fighter landed with a thud, as if it carried the collective weight of all the struggles his father had faced. Barron's voice didn't falter as he pressed on. "He has fought for what he believes in, even when it cost him his honor and his peace. He has stood up for what he thought was right, even when it made him a target. History may judge him, and I know it will, but I also believe that in the end, the truth will be recognized fairly." Barron's gaze swept the room again, this time lingering briefly on a few faces, analysts who had been among his father's harshest critics, now sitting motionless, their expressions unreadable. He let the silence stretch for a beat, as though daring anyone to challenge him. "And no matter what the world thinks," Barron continued, his voice softening slightly but losing none of its conviction, "I will always be proud to call him my father." His final words echoed in the stillness, the kind of silence that felt almost tangible. The air seemed charged, as if the weight of his message hung suspended over everyone in the room. Even the sound engineers in the control booth, typically immune to the drama unfolding on stage, were leaning forward, their attention fixed on the young man speaking with such clarity and resolve. The camera panned across the room, capturing the variety of reactions. One analyst, who had previously delivered scathing remarks about Donald Trump, now sat with their head bowed, their eyes clouded with thought. Another, seated closer to the stage, discreetly wiped away a tear that had slipped down their cheek. The audience, initially stunned into silence, began to stir. From somewhere in the back, a single clap broke the quiet, a slow, deliberate sound that rang out like a beacon. It was quickly joined by another, and then another, until the applause swelled into a wave of sound that filled the studio. The cameras caught audience members rising to their feet, their faces reflecting a mix of respect and admiration. Barron stood motionless amidst the applause. He didn't smile, nor did he appear triumphant. Instead, he bowed his head slightly in acknowledgement, his expression calm, almost serene. It was clear that he wasn't seeking approval or validation. This wasn't about winning an argument or proving a point. His demeanor suggested only one thing: that he had done what he believed was right. As the applause thundered on, the camera zoomed in on Barron's face, capturing the subtle flicker of emotion in his eyes, a mixture of relief, determination, and quiet fulfillment. In that moment, he wasn't just a young man defending his father. He was a voice of reason in a storm of judgment, a reminder of the humanity that often gets lost in political discourse. The applause eventually began to wane, but the energy in the room remained electric. Analysts exchanged glances, their earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, perhaps respect, perhaps reflection. The audience, too, seemed transformed, their expressions contemplative as they settled back into their seats. Barron had said his piece, and in doing so, he had shifted the tone of the room. He hadn't just defended his father. He had held up a mirror to everyone in that studio, and perhaps to everyone watching at home, forcing them to reconsider not only their judgments of his father but their approach to how they view others. For the first time that evening, the storm of criticism and debate had been replaced by something deeper: silence, reflection, and the undeniable power of truth spoken from the heart. Moments after Barron Trump stepped off the stage, clips of his speech began spreading like wildfire across social media platforms. From Twitter and Instagram to TikTok, the image of the young man standing tall, confidently addressing criticism of his father, became the centerpiece of heated discussions. One user wrote, "Barron Trump didn't just defend his father. He made us all stop and think. Behind politics are people, and behind those people are the love and sacrifices of a family." A clip of Barron's final words, "I will always be proud to call him my father," garnered millions of views within hours. The comments section overflowed with reactions, many expressing deep emotion. His words transcend politics. They embody love and sincerity. "We've forgotten that Donald Trump isn't just a politician. He's also a father." But not everyone agreed. Some voiced sharp criticism, dismissing Barron's speech as a staged performance. One user remarked, "This is nothing more than a PR stunt to rehabilitate the Trump family's image. He's just a teenager. Does he even understand what he's saying?" The debate quickly escalated, splitting social media into two distinct camps. One side praised Barron as a symbol of courage, while the other labeled him a tool of the Trump family. Amid the storm of opposing opinions, a post from a well-known journalist offered a moment of reflection. "Whether you agree or not, remember that Barron is only 17. Yet he's done something that few adults dare to do: stand up for the truth and his family. That deserves respect, no matter which side you're on." The post rapidly amassed hundreds of thousands of likes and comments. The hashtag #StandWithBarron began trending worldwide, as people shared stories of family love and loyalty inspired by his speech. The internet wasn't just divided by Barron's address. It was shaken by the authenticity and strength of a teenager who dared to face the world and speak his truth. In that moment, Barron Trump wasn't merely the son of a former president. He became a symbol of courage that rose above political controversy. When Barron returned home, he stepped into the living room where Melania and Donald Trump were waiting. The room was quiet, yet warmth radiated from their gazes. Barron, usually composed and reserved, now looked as though he had carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. He sank into a chair, his head bowed, letting out a long but relieved sigh. Melania, with the gentle eyes of a mother, walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. Her voice, soft but filled with undeniable pride, broke the silence. "Son, you've done something no one thought you could do. You didn't just defend your father. You reminded the entire world that family love is something no amount of criticism can break, no matter how cruel." Donald Trump, standing nearby, moved closer and placed his hand over Barron's. He bent slightly, looking straight into his son's eyes that today had reflected a maturity far beyond his years. Trump's voice, usually commanding and firm, was now quiet and sincere in a way rarely heard. "Barron, you didn't just defend me. You did something very few people are capable of. You reminded the world that truth and courage are always stronger than judgment. And you did it with your whole heart." Barron lifted his head, his eyes shimmering with a mix of relief and indescribable joy. A faint smile appeared on his lips, not out of pride, but because he knew deep down that he had done the right thing. "I only did what I had to do," he said, his voice soft but resolute. "So I didn't let anyone down." Melania sat beside him, taking his hand in hers, her eyes never leaving his face. "No, Barron, you didn't just do the right thing. You did more than I could have ever hoped for, and I will always be proud of you." The room fell silent for a moment, not from the absence of sound, but from the overwhelming warmth of love and pride that filled the air. Outside, the world continued to buzz with debates and conflicting opinions, but inside this room, only one thing mattered: family. Donald Trump placed one hand on Melania's shoulder and the other firmly on Barron's. "No matter what people say out there, this family will always stand together. You've reminded me, Barron, that no matter what happens in the world, love and truth will always prevail." The three of them sat together, no words needed. In that moment, they understood that no storm raging outside could shake the foundation of their bond. Family love was, and would always remain, their greatest strength. In a world filled with judgment and controversy, only the love of family shines as a light that never fades. When we stand together, nothing can bring us down. Always remember, love is not just an emotion. It is the strength to overcome any challenge, the truth that cannot be distorted, and the unwavering belief that anchors us in the midst of uncertainty. Barron, in the light of your courage and love, you've left a message not just for your family but for the world. Keep moving forward with faith and sincerity, because good things will always come to those who love and defend the truth. Stay strong and hold on to your values, for in the eyes of your parents, you are not just a son, you are our greatest pride. We don't need to be perfect to be loved. We only need to be genuine, to stand up for the people we care about, and to live with integrity, no matter how noisy the world becomes. Family love will always be the quiet haven where we find peace.